The next project that you'll be working on is Control versus Chaos. This project you worked on that very first day of class when we made those abstract, warm and cool little paintings where we kind of splashed around the color. You will be now using that piece of paper for the Control Chaos project. This project also focuses on the elements and principles of pattern and rhythm. The first piece we'll look at here is by Piet Mondrian, Broadway Boogie Woogie. Mondrian was interested in how art and music and dance relate. You can see this is a very abstract work. What do you think the pattern is that you see within this piece? What's the thing that's repeated over and over again? If you said squares, you're right. There's a huge variety of squares. There's squares everywhere you look. Big squares, little squares, squares repeated. What's the thing that helps to bring rhythm to this piece? Rhythm is when something is similar yet changes. So if we look, the color is something that changes, sometimes red, sometimes blue, sometimes white. Also, size matters, right? We see big squares, little squares, squares that go all around the outside. You can think about rhythm as being something cyclical or like poetry. Mondrian really thought that was a way that art and music could relate. For example, in Broadway Boogie Woogie, he was interested in the idea of jazz. And if any of you know anything about jazz, part of jazz is that you have a common beat, but it alters. And every time that you play, it's a little bit different. So you get little surprises. And you can see that in Mondrian's work. There's little blips or surprises or bigger or larger squares. This is a work by Maya Lin. And if you don't know who Maya Lin is, she also did the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. This is sort of her famous work. But she also did this piece. This is Maya Lin's Storm King Wave Field. How do you think this focuses in on pattern and rhythm? Rhythm is used a little bit differently here. You can think about rhythm in one of three ways. The first way is we look at the ground. You notice those look like hills, but they're not quite natural hills. They almost look like waves or waves crashing into a shore. So those waves are meant to represent the rhythm of water, right? Beating up against a shore, sort of that natural cyclical movement. The other way that rhythm is used, if we think about this scene, do you think this scene looks the same any time of year? Or does it change depending on the season? In the fall, those trees in the background will be yellow and bright. In the winter, it might be covered with snow. In the summer, it'll be bright green. So nature's natural rhythm also shows in this piece. And the last way we can think about pattern and rhythm is with shapes, right? There's that sort of organic shape that's made within each of those waves, the repeated pattern of the trees going back in the distance. It's more kind of a formal way of thinking about the idea of rhythm. This is a piece by Gustav Klimt. How is rhythm used in this piece? Well, if we think to the Maya Lin piece, of course there is the rhythm that we see in nature, right? We know this is fall, so the rhythm of the seasons could be kind of implied. But there's also some of those formal rhythm that we talked about before in the shapes of the trees. Right? The tree shape is similar, but not exactly the same. There's little changes. Within the trees, there's those little shapes, if you've ever seen aspen or birch, they have those little eye holes that are similar yet change. And also the leaves, right? We see the color of the leaves repeated as it goes back with bigger and smaller shapes of similar color. This is a work by Paul Klee, Landscape with Yellow Birds, 1923. How is rhythm used in this piece? Well, we see similar shapes, right? The bulging silver forms repeated in similar yet different ways. We see the birds, similar yet different ways. Each little piece of coral repeated in different reds and blues. The eye repeats these forms and it follows around the page. So they're not all exactly the same, but there's little differences that keep it interesting. How is rhythm being used in this piece? Or we could say building, right? This is a piece by Leon Battista Alberti, or it's in Mantua, designed in 1470. And when we think about architecture, can architecture have rhythm? Yes, absolutely, right? What shapes do you see repeated in this form? Well, the first thing that catches my eye is that archway, right? If you look at that archway right in the middle of the piece, let me get my clicker out here. You see that big archway in the middle, right? And then that arch is repeated in the windows, it's repeated in these facades, it's repeated in the top of the building. It's even repeated as you go back through each little hallway. So it's that similar shape repeated in different ways. And if we go inside, we see those same archways on the inside. So those archways follow our eye all the way around the space. And he also uses this with other shapes. If you notice the circles repeated, the squares, geometric shapes repeated over and over again in different ways. That's what rhythm is. So to relate this back to our control chaos piece, so we've started off with something that really doesn't have any particular rhythm or pattern. It's been randomly splashed onto a page, and your job is to create order from this chaos. So how will we create order? Well, through pattern and repetition. So how you want to do this is up to you. It could be a more representational form, like you see in this first student example. So if you're looking, there's clearly very sort of an underwater scene. They've taken their two pieces together to make them connect into one. But they've used their 6 patterns, which remember, that's one of your warm-up assignments. You have to think about 6 patterns and how you might use it on this piece. They've got the pattern of the scales that they've used repeatedly throughout different fish. They also have the pattern that they used of the coral texture. They also have a bubble texture that they've repeated in different patterns. So even though part of the goal of this is just to think about different patterns and how you might use them rhythmically throughout your piece, they've used it in a representational way. The next student chose to apply that idea very differently in their piece. They still have what appeared to be somewhat abstracted coral or sort of an underwater theme, but they've more just followed the natural pattern that was created when they splashed the different colors on the page. So you can see, we see those repeated patterns in the line work and some of the stippling pieces, but they've chose to divide it in different ways. Here's Here's another example. And also, for some reason, a lot of students tend to go underwater themed. That's obviously not a requirement, but I can see when you're splashing around water how somehow water ends up as a theme in your work. But this is another example where we can see the pattern used. We see the repeated pattern of line. We also see some stippling. We see some other little, I don't know what you call that exactly, this little kind of organic webbing that they've used in different ways, and thought about how they used it throughout the piece. If you notice, a lot of students also end up filling some areas in completely black. If that helps you to bring order to the chaos, you're more than welcome to do that. So you can kind of think of this as sort of an ultimate doodling contest. If anybody ever, when they're sitting talking on the phone or doing something else, starts to doodle, this is a lot of really kind of meticulous work where you're just filling in areas. But you also want to think about your pieces as a whole. How are you going to create that visual flow, keep your eye moving around the page, have your composition visually balanced? So if you have a really dark area on one side, you either balance it with more dark or another larger white space. You really want to think about how the overall composition looks as you start filling in those patterns. We'll just look at a few more examples. Like I said, this one also kind of has a little bit of representation to it, sort of another underwater theme where you see the use of the bubble pattern there that sort of becomes an octopus. But remember, this can be completely abstract. You can think about it in a formal way where you're just balancing the composition through use of the patterns that you decided to use. So the student really just had their circle, square, octagon, stripe pattern, and they filled each one in different ways. So it can be completely abstract as well. You also want to think about positive and negative shapes. A lot of times we think of the color as being the positive shape, but the negative shape can also be the black, and maybe that's where some interesting things happen. Remember, it's completely up to you how you want to divide up the space, how abstract or realistic you want to make your images. Just look at a couple more examples here. So remember, have fun with this project. There's no right or wrong way to do it, or you're just really thinking about the overall composition, how to create rhythm and pattern, and have that create visual flow throughout your work. And think about really balancing those positive and negative spaces within your piece.